Good morning, everyone. I'm Sharon. I'm a postdoc with Ari. This morning, I'll be introducing our keynote speaker, Professor Jonathan Rigg. We are privileged to have Professor Jonathan Rigg as the keynote speaker of this year's Asian Graduate Forum. Professor Jonathan Rigg is a development geographer concerned with highlighting and explaining patterns and processes of social, economic, and environmental change in the Asian region, and the impact of such changes on ordinary people and everyday life. Professor Rigg has supervised more than 20 PhD students through to completion. He has written several so-authored books on development and modernization in Southeast Asia. For his keynote speech, he will be discussing how the Asian family adjusts itself in the face of rapid economic transformation. Can we welcome Professor Rigg?
Okay, morning everyone. Gosh, that's you're all bright. I saw you all tucking into breakfast. Some of you seem to be like hobbits and have 2 or 3 breakfasts, but I can't have breakfast because I'm too nervous sitting here. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's an honour to be able to give this keynote. First one. I'm also, a bit apprehensive, and kind of on 3 grounds. First of all, this is a bit of a departure for me. You needn't necessarily have read my work, but I mostly work on agrarian change. I kind of work in villages in Southeast Asia, mostly mainland Southeast Asia, and I kind of talk to farmers. And I've never done anything on this sort of thing before, so it's a bit of a departure for me, so we'll see how that goes. Secondly, it's not only a departure, it's new in the sense that I haven't given this talk before. It's a book I'm writing at the moment, and there's a chapter with a title a little like this. So you're kind of guinea pigs. So we'll see how it works. And the third reason is that you're Southeast Asian, and so this is all something that you're experiencing. You're part of the neoliberal family, and so in that sense, you've got an outsider talking about you personally, and that makes me a little bit nervous as well. Okay, so building the neoliberal family. First of all, what do I mean by neoliberal? And I suppose I mean it in 2 ways. I mean it in the way that kind of David Harvey thinks about neoliberalism as a sort of high-level theory of political economic practices, and we're probably all familiar with that. So I mean it in that way, a sort of high-level interpretation of neoliberalism. I also mean it, though, in a slightly lower level, in the way in which we are created as neoliberal subjects, the way in which states shape us in certain ways. I'm not suggesting to you that all Southeast Asian states are neoliberal in the David Harvey sense of the word, and I'm not suggesting to you that you are all neoliberal citizen subjects. But we're kind of all being shaped to a greater or lesser degree in some of those ways that David Harvey is referring to. I suppose more particularly, I'm thinking of what happens to households and families under processes of market integration. So as the countries that we work on in Southeast Asia become more intensively linked into the market, as market relations become more obvious, more overt, stronger, what happens to the household? What happens to the family? Does it remain in the way that it's always been, or is it changed in particular ways? So the kind of question that underpins this presentation and the chapter is kind of in many ways quite simply stated. And it's essentially what happens to the family and the household under the forces of market integration. So under the forces of the market imperative. And that's what I want to explore this morning. I suppose there are also normative undertones to that question. What sort of families are desirable? It's a kind of problematic question. What's the role for the state in creating such families? Is there a role for the state? Can the forces of economic change be manipulated to produce favourable social outcomes? And I suppose, will the Asian family evolve in different ways from families elsewhere? So those are all kind of difficult questions, which don't have simple answers, but they underpin that higher level question that I just posed. Okay, in the 1990s, I think we tended to see Asian political leaders and policy makers suggesting that somehow the region's economic transformations, which were so very obvious, would not be translated into a set of social and cultural transformations which would mirror what's happened in the global north. That there's something exceptional about Asia. I mean, this has been said many times before. There's something exceptional about Asia that would somehow protect or insulate it from what were perceived to be the untoward, the unpalatable social outcomes of economic transformations in the north. And that's reflected in this quote here. Asian characteristics are often invoked to turn accepted wisdom about development, social order and authority upside down. There is a push by Asian value supporters to expose and overturn the culturally specific implications of much accepted dogma in the social sciences. So this kind of sort of sense that maybe the way in which social sciences in the north, in Europe and North America, have thought about social change and the links between social change and economic change would not be replicated in a simple way in the countries, if you like, the non-Western world, in this case in Asia, more particularly in Southeast Asia. And nowhere, I think, is that more evident, this sort of case for Asian exceptionalism, than when it comes to understanding family and household. So people sort of thought, well, we cannot read off from what's happened in the north under forces of economic change and the way in which that's impacted upon the nature of the family and the household. We cannot read off from that what's going to happen in the Asian context. That strikes me as kind of problematic assumption that that's not going to happen. I mean, it's also a problematic assumption that it will happen. But I think we kind of need to kind of question what underpins that belief. And I think sometimes policymakers and politicians and some scholars have kind of failed to grapple with the way in which economic transformations would kind of re-engineer society, so that societal outcomes will happen notwithstanding people's hopes and beliefs and desires. And the sorts of things I'm thinking about are falling fertility rates, aging population, growing levels of migration and mobility, the entry of women, particularly young unmarried women, into the non-farm workforce, rising levels of education, smaller families, declining terms of trade between farm and non-farm, all of those sorts of things, and there are many more as well, will have significant societal implications. So I kind of, in the sense, what I'm saying is that the status quo cannot be sustained. And what I want to do today is kind of think that through. So how will the family change? I'm not suggesting to you whether it can change in good ways or bad ways. I'm just saying, how will it change? How do these forces of economic transformation impact upon society? So, when we look at family, this is me sitting, this is in Mahasarakham in northeast Thailand. These are some of the people I've been kind of studying for the last 25 years. And if you look at this photo, you'll see almost all of them are, almost as old as me, maybe older than me in most cases. This wasn't because I said, hey, all you old people, come and sit by me and we'll have a photo taken. They were the ones who were there. Yeah? This is a kind of village in northeast Thailand in Mahasarakham that's kind of bereft of the vitality of youth. There aren't many young people there. And that obviously has implications for the family and household. So that's the sort of thing that I want to talk about. I would say in the last decade or so, since say around about 2000, there's been a proliferation of terms. Social scientists love coining terms, don't they? A proliferation of terms which I think get at some of the transformations in family and household that are occurring in Asia. Most of these come from scholars working on Asia, although obviously there are also scholars working on other parts of the world. If you look at them, left behind children, absentee mothers, care deficit, distance mothering, remote parenting, transnational motherhood, they all kind of have negative connotations. Yeah, they're not. I mean, they're not all negative, but the ones at the bottom here aren't. Multi-sided, split apart. That's a kind of statement of kind of descriptive statement of what's happening. But most of them seem to me to have negative connotations. Now, I'm not suggesting to you, as I've already said, that these are necessarily problematic processes. You could argue that the release of young women from patriarchal family contexts is actually an empowering and a sort of liberating process. So I think some of the changes may actually be positive. But it's interesting how so many of the terms are negative in tone. Okay, the household. What do we mean? There are probably sociologists in here, anthropologists who know more about the household than I do. But I mean, the household in classical terms is the co-residential dwelling unit. Yeah, that the household, as opposed to the family, the household is based on proximity. It's a spatial unit. It's people living under one roof, eating from one cooking pot. It's about propinquity. Yeah, it's about people living in proximity to one another. Now, the reason why the household kind of classically emerged in that way was not because it had to be that way. It was simply because it was that way. I mean, most households in Asia, less so in Africa, had a kind of spatial address, which meant that the household as a spatial designation of social relations kind of worked. So it was so because that's the way it happened. And I suppose that's also become normative. That's the way it should be as well. So I think some of those negative terms that I had in the last slide is because of the way in which the household has been reworked. It's been changed from how it originally was, and that is seen as problematic. These are the sort of classic functions of the household. Sharing of labour, managing of resources, meeting the existential needs of the members of the household, raising children, caring for the elderly, all those sorts of things. And what has happened over the last 10, 20, 30 years is the spatial designation of the household and the way in which those functions are delivered has become sort of unpicked. That those functions are no longer spatially rooted in the way that they were. And there are two terms. Oh, wait, no, I'll give you, that's right. Just to give you an indication of that, this is from some work that I undertook with a sort of colleague who works at Konkan University, Ajahn Borpan. This was done 2002, so about 18 months ago, where we're looking at kind of first and second generation migrants in 3 villages in Konkan province in northeast Thailand. And the reason why I've put this here is because this is from our sample, and you can see most households still own land. 81% own land, 79% with rice land. They're still, in a sense, farming households. They still have a presence in the village, on the land. And yet, also, if you can see this at the bottom, I'm not sure if you can, every family virtually had an absent family member. 75% of heads of household had been migrants at some point. So this is a village in northeast Thailand which is very much kind of caught up in these changes from the household as a co-residential dwelling unit to the household as something new and different. I'll kind of return to that in a moment. There are 2 terms that are used. One is global householding. Mike Douglas, who is here at ARI, coined this term. And for him, this is global householding. Formation and sustenance of households is increasingly reliant on the global movement of people and transactions among household members originating from or residing in more than one national territory. This is about, if you like, the economic and livelihood implications. That's what he's focusing on in that definition of transnational movement. And the second one is the transnational family. And here I've got a definition from Brycerson and Varela. This refers to families that live some or most of their time separated from each other, yet hold together and create something that can be seen as a feeling of collective welfare and unity, namely familyhood, even across national borders. This is kind of about the emotional, I think, and social essence of the family and the household. So that those two terms sort of picking up on the same process, migration, mobility across borders, and yet they're kind of focusing on different things. I mean, I think Mike Douglas is kind of focusing on the livelihood implications, whereas Bryson's focusing more on the emotional side. But I mean, I think they're kind of quite closely tied. Something that I think is problematic with both the terms, at least for my purposes, is that it sees these changes occurring when people move across national borders. In most cases, people don't. I mean, that table I just put up from northeast Thailand, most of those migrants, they're not crossing national borders. They're moving to Bangkok or to the eastern seaboard or up to Chiang Mai to work. And yet it's having the same effect. So I think we can think of global householding and the transnational family actually as too limiting. And we need to think about the way that households and families are being reworked by domestic processes as well as international movements. Okay. This then kind of leads on to what I call here the care puzzle. If you like, the care contradiction. Migration is becoming increasingly important, critical to maintaining the existential survival of the household. If people didn't migrate, they wouldn't be able to meet their needs. Yeah, I mean, they might have survived in kind of absolute terms, but as the pressure of needs increases, migration has become a critical component of that. And yet, migration undermines the reproduction of the household. So the kind of production and reproduction of the household are now in conflict, that one kind of rubs up uneasily against the other. In order to meet the production needs of the household, the reproduction needs have to be undermined. So that's the kind of puzzle that I suppose underpins this paper. So I see I've written here in the chapter, production for the family is in conflict with the reproduction of the family. And that's kind of what I'm interested in exploring. And I've got a quote here from some work by Catherine Locke on Vietnam, where she quotes one of her respondents who says, "If I want to provide for them, my children, I have to migrate. But when I migrate, I cannot take care of them." So that kind of, in essence, I mean, that migrant is kind of summed up, in a sense, in just those two sentences, what this paper is about. I think there are two, I suppose, processes. One I mentioned already, migration. The other, which are important to this, understanding this, the other one is the decline in total fertility rates. So the rapid decline in the size of households, families in Southeast Asia. And I'll just kind of quickly go through those. I suppose the thing to say about declining fertility is that if you go back in the literature, it was a real surprise to most demographers. They did not expect fertility rates to decline in Southeast Asia in the way that they have. And this is Freeman saying this. You know, when I first began studying Asia's fertility and family planning effort 33 years ago, neither I nor other serious observers expected such rapid fertility declines to occur on that continent. And I'll just show you some figures. You may be familiar with these. This is total fertility rates for countries of Southeast Asia and East Asia. So in other words, this is the number of children that a woman will have in her lifetime. You can see here that in the 1960s and 70s, most women in most countries were having 4, 5, 6, in some cases 7 children. So that was the fertility rate. So when Freeman started his work, that was the pattern of fertility across Southeast Asia. 1980, beginning to come down. The ones that are shaded in green, this is fertility at less than replacement levels. Yeah, kind of replacement levels is about 2.1, 2.2. It varies between countries, but around about 2.1. So if you fall below 2.1, if that's sustained over a long period, populations will not be replaced. You'll start in time to have a declining population. This is 1990. You can see, so if I go back to 1980, the only countries, Singapore here, of course, and Japan, less than replacement. 1990, we see those countries joined by Hong Kong and South Korea. 2000, we've got Thailand, Vietnam, China, and North Korea joining that set. And then the most recent data for 2011, you've got Malaysia, Myanmar, where you can see they're joining them too. So most countries of East and Southeast Asia now have less than replacement level. Yeah, so in other words, families, I mean, in Thailand, where I do most of my work, they're closing primary schools now. Yeah, there aren't enough children to sustain schools. I mean, when I did my PhD in 1982, they were building them like crazy because they were trying to improve, and now they're closing them. So in my short period of working, I've gone through from building them in order to educate people in rural areas of Thailand to closing them because there aren't enough children to fill those schools. I mean, just a phenomenally rapid rate of transformation. And that's going to have implications for the family and for the household. And this is Gavin Jones, who's also here in Singapore, writing, Asia's fertility transition has been one of the most fundamental and consequential developments in Pacific Asia in the last half of the 20th century, and it will vitally affect prospects for the way their populations will live in the 21st century and beyond. So that's an important kind of background issue. It's going to lead to these sorts of changes. Aging of the population, declining in household size, shifts in dependency patterns, geriatrification of farming, and so on. Yeah, lots of changes will occur as a result of falling total fertility rates. The other theme is migration. Yeah, so I think these are the kind of two transformations which I think have a bearing on how households and families work. And I've got here a kind of migration transition matrix, which is kind of problematic, I know, because anyone talks about transitions, they get told that they're just Rostow, and that, you know, modernization theory doesn't work and transitions don't work, and things occur in different places in different ways and at different rates and so forth. There you are. So I know this is problematic. I find it kind of useful as a didactic to think about how migration has changed over time. So kind of bear with me. And what I've got down here is a graph from that earlier work I talked about with Ajahn Burpan in the 3 villages. These are migrants, date of first leaving from the 3 villages we worked in. The first migrants left in the 1970s. These are the second generation migrants. So these are effectively the children of the first generation migrants. Yeah? So this is kind of what's happened over time. So I'm just using it as a way of thinking about my transition. So if we kind of go to the early stages, the 1970s, say, of migration. Migration in the places I've worked in Laos, in Vietnam, in Thailand, so mainland Southeast Asia, it was pretty rare in rural areas where I worked. And if it did occur, it was mostly men. I mean, generally women did not move. I mean, there were a few exceptions, but there's a kind of general rule that didn't happen. Then in the 1980s, of course, Southeast Asia's industrial transformation, foreign direct investment, and the need for cheap labour. And so we suddenly saw an increase in migration in the 1980s. Not only that, but women beginning to move, young, unmarried women. So this was the kind of dutiful daughter type of migration stream. Unmarried young women, men as well, of course, moving to work outside the village for the sake of the family, and hence dutiful daughter. Then in the 1990s, you kind of see, if you like, an aging of the migration stream. You get what work in the Philippines called martyr mothers. I mean, here in Singapore, of course, many, many martyr mothers looking after Singaporean children, making this place run. Yeah, they are leaving children behind. So there was a kind of important transformation, I think. It obviously varies between countries, but some point in the 80s and 90s where the dutiful daughter was replaced by the martyr mother. And then, if we kind of go ahead further still, in the 3 villages that we worked in recently in Khon Kaen, there are people who have been away for 20 years. Families still expect them to come back, but no one knows when. And you sort of wonder whether they'll ever return. Yeah. So kind of migration becoming a longer and longer term absence. Whether it's permanent, I don't know. In a sense, no one knows. But that's the kind of sort of migration transition within which household change is embedded. As I say, it will vary between countries, but that's just a kind of one way of thinking about it. Okay. Right, I'll skip that. There are we can pick out kind of trends. I'll just kind of run through some data drawing from Southeast Asia and also from China to show you how the household and the family are changing. Yeah, just to kind of show the extent to which things are being transformed. Proportion of children in China living in households with migrant members has risen from 11% in 1997 to 39% in 2006, so quadrupling or approaching that. Children with migrant parents in China were 5% in 97, 28% in 2006. Around about half of women migrants to Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City were married, and 82% of those married at first move had at least one child, so they were leaving children behind. That's in the most recent Vietnam Living Standards Survey. In Thailand, the proportion of children being raised by grandparents rose from 2% to 8% between 1986 and 2006. Those aged 60 and over living alone increased from 4 to 8%, so it's doubled, and the proportion living alone or with their spouses increased from 11 to 26%. Yep. So something significant is happening across Asia in the way that people live. Yeah, the structures, the family and household forms within which they're embedded. So then I can sort of think, right, well, what does that mean? I mean, should we be worried? How do people manage that? How has Asian society dealt with that phenomenal change in the way in which people live? So we come back to this kind of care paradox. This is a village in North Vietnam, in Thanh Hoa, which I worked in with a rural sociologist at Vietnam National University a few years ago. And it's full of abandoned houses like this. And in a sense, absence, I mean, this is extreme absence, but absence sustains the village. I mean, the reason why there are people living in this village, despite this picture, there are people in the village. The reason why there are people living in this village is because there are some people who aren't living in the village. Yeah, it's because people leave that other people can stay. Yeah. So the survival of the village and village livelihoods is dependent on people leaving. And to show the degree of change, this is a longitudinal study from Dondeng, undertaken by a Japanese scholar. This is for 1981 and 2002. This is village-based production. Village-based agricultural, village-based non-agricultural, non-village-based. Yeah, and you can see that in 1981, 2/3 of income was derived from village-based activities. It comes back to this point I made right at the start about the co-residential dwelling unit. Yeah, the way in which rural livelihoods were based in and around the village. They were spatially located. There was a kind of coincidence of livelihoods as a way of getting by and the household as a social unit. This is the figure for 2002. 1/5 is now village-based. 4/5 is non-village-based. Yeah. So villages have to be increasingly across Southeast Asia are sustained by absence. But there's also a growing crisis of care, and I've got Locke's quote down here again. So how do we how have families got around that paradox, that contradiction? And I put here a quote from a migrant we interviewed in Hanoi in 2011, I think it was. And he was talking about, he was a butcher in Hanoi, and he was talking about his homeland, the village he came from, and his kind of relationship with it. And he said this, I'll just kind of read it out. I love my homeland. However, I do not love agriculture. Farming is a hard job. I was even a good farmer, but I do not like farming. The homeland is where I was born. The homeland brought me up. The homeland is in my heart. The young and capable should choose cities. The old should live in the countryside. When you are of working age, you should live in cities. When you retire, you should live in the countryside. And there he was, kind of justifying and trying to explain his emotional and kind of functional relationship between the city where he worked and where he came from, which is several hundred kilometers outside Hanoi. Okay, I will get on to the kind of the implications of all this in just a moment. I think I've got 10 minutes. But it might be worth kind of thinking about how do Southeast Asian societies support their elderly populations? Kind of big picture stuff. And we can divide that into, I think, 3 types of support. Public transfers, that tends to what happens in Europe. The state provides pensions, state-funded pensions for people at retirement age. Yeah, so most of Europe has a kind of public transfers of money from working age populations to the retired cohort. Asset-based reallocations. So in other words, people save money during their working life and they draw down on those savings when they retire. And then there are familial transfers. So the elderly are supported by their families, by the working age members of their families. So we just look at how that kind of works out across regions. I mean, again, in general terms, in Europe, public transfers are very high. Asset-based reallocations are significant, but not, they don't outweigh public transfers. Familial transfers are often negative. Grandparents, if you like, supporting their grandchildren, often paying school fees, giving them, helping out their children. So actually, it works the other way in many cases. For East Asia, all 3 are kind of, it varies between countries, but kind of balanced. Public transfers, asset-based reallocations, and familial transfers. We see them all kind of playing quite a significant role. For Southeast Asia, public transfers are negligible. In some cases, they're negative. Effectively, the elderly are taxed by the state to support the non-elderly, people of working age. And some countries, of course, have done their best to make sure that the state doesn't get involved in supporting the elderly. That's a kind of, that's a state directive. It's an attempt not to go down the European road. It's seen as problematic. Asset-based reallocations are high and familial transfers are significant. So in other words, what I'm kind of suggesting to you is that the big picture of how the elderly are supported is qualitatively different in most countries of Southeast Asia than it is, say, in Europe and North America and East Asia. And that's important to sort of bear in mind when we think about questions like, how will the elderly be supported in 20 years' time? Who's going to pick up the tab? At the moment, states are not doing it and do not wish to do it. And therefore, the buck stops somewhere else. Okay, so what's happening to families? This is a family I've interviewed 3 times. First of all in 1982, then in 1994, and most recently in 2008. So I've seen this family kind of evolve over time. This was its situation in 2008, 2009. And what we've got, just to explain, this is the co-residential dwelling unit. So this is who lives in the village, these people here. This is, so the husband died in 1975. The mother is 59, lives in the village. She looks after her grandchildren, who are aged 15, or at that time were aged 15 and 7. We've got her daughter, lives and works in Bangkok, is married to a man. So they're living apart. So that sort of explains the diagram. So what we have here is we have the elderly alone. We have absentee mothers, fathers. We have remote parenting, as it's sometimes termed. And we have left behind children. This is very common in the places I work. You work in other places. I don't know where. A few of you are nodding. Maybe some of you are shaking your heads. A few nodding. This is the sort of household form that if someone said to me in 1982, this is what I would see, I wouldn't have believed. I would have said, no, it's never going to work out like this. So this is what I mean by the way in which the kind of forces of economic transformation, the need to meet the material needs of the household, has forced on Asian families and households innovative ways of kind of restructuring themselves. That sounds horribly kind of technical and engineering, but this is the sort of outcome.
Do the the middle generation, do they live together?
Yes, they do. They live in Bangkok together. In some cases, of course, you'll have one absent rather than both absent, but both absent is actually becoming increasingly common as well. So what does that mean? There are kind of two, what are the outcomes? Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How do we read it? What do we read off? Of course, it can be both those things. But there are two problems. One is that for Asia, Southeast Asia, we don't have great data sets on this sort of thing. The second, I think more of an issue is a methodological one, which is the kind of omitted variable problem, which is that if you compare migrants and non-migrants, they're not the same. Yeah? Migrants are a specific social group, and the reasons that we might see in the difference between migrants and non-migrants may be nothing to do with migration. It may predate migration. Yeah? So the omitted variable problem is a real issue in a lot of migration studies. People survey migrants, they survey non-migrants, they find that, migrants are wealthier, or migrants are poorer, or migrants are 5 minutes, are happier, or whatever. But it may have been like that beforehand, and that's why they're migrants. Anyway, let's look through. This is, I'll go through these quickly. This is from a study from 5 provinces in China. It's a sample size, was it 400? 400 left behind children and 200 non-left behind children. And this kind of just shows the effects of migration. So this is frequency of participation in farm work before and during migration. So this is before migration, this is during migration. Yeah, you can see children picking up farm work. This is participation in housework before migration, during migration. This is children's tutor. Before migration, mostly the mother or the father. During migration. This is children's ranking of the most important person in their life. Father and mother on the left. Before migration. During migration. Okay? So you can kind of see what's happening here. From this paper, it was published 2011 in Journal of Peasant Studies. The authors conclude, children who are left behind in the rural communities have paid a high price for these economic benefits of migration. In summary, many of the impacts of parent migration for children may be defined as negative. These children not only shouldered heavy labour burdens in housework, farm work and caring for other family members, but also suffered from psychological pressures and even the risks of misbehaviour and abnormality. I'm not quite sure what they mean by that. Anyway, they have less time for play and study. Migration impacts their emotional security and associated personal development in terms of behaviour, personality, and educational potential. So this is a very negative paper on the effects of migration on the left behind. Of course, not all papers are like that. There's Bryant's from 2005, slightly earlier. The evidence to date suggests that these children of migrants do not, on average, suffer greater social and economic problems than their peers. This is because migration is generally an effective way for households to alleviate poverty, and so forth. So, how do we explain that difference? Of course, individual households are different, and different countries have different ways of dealing with it. And it's possible, it's likely that both those outcomes are going to emerge. I think we can kind of think about caring in two ways. One is that first study, the one from China. It's a kind of care deficit argument, that migration leads to a care deficit, reduced emotional support, reduced parental time, and that leads to truancy from school, heightened levels of anxiety, and so forth. The other approach is the kind of adaptive caring approach. Here at NUS, sort of Brenda Yeo's done a lot of work on this sort of thing. So people saying, how do the family adapt to the absence of children? And, how do they successfully deal with it? Use of ICTs, paid for carers, care by the father. So fathers take on some of those roles if the mother's absent. And that leads to intense distance mothering, alternative caring strategies, and so on. So this is the kind of positive take. This is the way that families might adjust to this new household world. So we have kind of two views, I suppose, of Asian society, possibly. One is of a flexible and resilient society. This is the work of John Noble, who's done a lot of work on Thailand. The Thai people are doing their best to manoeuvre through unprecedented social and economic change, and they continue to lean on strong cultural traditions. So this is the kind of sort of Asian exceptionalism argument. that somehow cultural traditions will permeate these changes, that we're able to live through them and be able to adapt and be resilient in the face of these sorts of changes. But I think even in his work, there's this sense that there might be a looming 2 minutes care crisis. We get that, some of these, if you like, the figures, the raw figures of the number of children being raised by grandparents, the number of parents absent, the number of elderly living alone or just with their spouse, that all of those things, that it will lead to a care crisis in time. So even John Nodal, who generally is quite positive, says there might be something just around the corner we need to watch out for. Okay, I have 3 more slides, I think it is. I put this in at the end. It kind of doesn't quite link with what I've just said, but I think it's important. There's a term that's been coined in Europe, the Prokaryote. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Prokaryote. The Prokaryote was coined by someone called Guy Standing, who used to work at the International Labour Organization. And the Prokaryote obviously joins together an adjective, precarious, with a class distinction, or group, noun, of the proletariat, to create the Prokaryote. And it's argued that what we see in Europe, and I think we also see in Asia, is the emergence of people living increasingly precarious lives. They no longer have the surety of, if you like, the moral economy, in inverted commas, of the village, and self-sustenance on the land. And yet they're not becoming a working class. So they haven't got the kind of guarantees of the working class. There's this sort of new form emerging, the Prokaryote. And you can see that in the way, this comes back to the neoliberalism point. This is the Global Competitiveness Report from 2013-14. This is scary. I'm almost there. I'll just read this. This is kind of what we're all tied up in. The efficiency and flexibility of the labour market are critical for ensuring that workers are allocated to their most effective use in the economy and provided with incentives to give their best effort in their jobs. Labour markets must therefore have the flexibility to shift workers from one economic activity to another rapidly and at low cost, and to allow for wage fluctuations without much social disruption. In other words, you should be able to kind of sack people, move them out, restructure, rationalise, downsize, at a click of a finger. This is what's creating the Prokaryote, and this is the neoliberal angle. This goes back to David Harvey and his work. And this is what these new kind of households and family forms are living within. So, for Asia, last slide, this really is it. For the Global South, I'm sorry about these terms, they're really ghastly, but in the pre-modern era, we had what I call here a self-reliant. People were generally relatively self-reliant. They are living on the land, meeting most of their needs. Then we had the move into what, even uglier, the informal area, the informal economy, which is what the ILO identified in Kenya in 1972 and coined the term the informal economy. And now we have the emergence of a Prokaryote. And the way in which people sustain themselves, and the link between the state and wages and savings and family and community are changing in a really fundamental way. And that has implications for how families and households operate. And that is the end.